This is the Perri Peltz Show on SiriusXM. Here's your host, Perri Peltz.
Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you could join us for this hour as we continue our conversations about the global pandemic, COVID-19, and how that's impacting everyone's lives. Tricia Rose is with us. Tricia is a professor at Brown University. She's the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies, Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and currently working on a project that illuminates the way that structural racism works. Tricia, welcome. We're so glad you could be with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Tricia, of course, the devastating pandemic that is impacting all of us, as we now know, impacts communities of color so much worse. Talk to us a little bit as an overview of what's going on and what you think that people need to understand.
Right. Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is that, everyone really is suffering across the board, and the vast majority of people, no matter their racial or class background, are significantly in danger and are worried and have lost a number of people. And this is a serious point of continuity. That said, we are experiencing crises such as this one, differentially based on race and class, but especially the way race and class work together, because the pandemic is revealing and bringing to the surface the impact of long-standing levels of disparate treatment and forms of structurally produced inequality. So what that means is that across numbers of significant aspects of society, including education, jobs, health, access to health facilities, all of the things that would be really important in a pandemic are already fraying. All of the safety nets, all of the circumstances for poor people of color are ongoingly basically disadvantaged in such a way that when a crisis hits, it hits much harder. So it's not that people are somehow doing something differently during the crisis. It's the lead up to the crisis where all of that work happens.
It's such a good point, because you see these disparities and health disparities in so many different disease entities. One of the words, I feel like there's so many terms and phrases that have become part of our lexicon during this pandemic. And one of the words that we hear a lot is structural racism. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. And it has begun to show up more and more. So the term structural racism refers very specifically to the way that forms of discrimination that take place either in the past or the present work together in intersecting ways to produce a systemic effect overall. So structural racism is to be distinguished from something like personal or individual bias or individual prejudice, which does not necessarily have a structural dimension. A structural form of racism is in context where, say, certain communities are not allowed to get adequate loans or lending from banking institutions, or neighborhoods in the historical practices of redlining would create forms of structural racism. A lack of access or spending for education, right, based on neighborhoods and those who populate those neighborhoods. Mass incarceration, where sentencing for one drug is 10 times the level of sentencing for another. These are structural forms of racism where, when we think across areas, this is very important. So institutional racism is different because, it might be, say, discrimination in education alone. But structural means, how does educational discrimination impact with wealth disparity, impact with mass incarceration rates, and so on. So a structural approach allows us to look across various areas and to see the compounding intersectional effects across the board.
So when it comes to COVID-19, what is it that we need to be thinking about when it comes to structural racism?
Oh, it's extremely important. And the irony is that when it shows up, we're still willing to imagine that the impact in one area is completely separate from another, right? So that's what structural racism helps us avoid. It helps us avoid imagining that one problem is completely separate. So let's take a few COVID-19 elements. Social distancing. Let's start with that one, right? This is pretty much saving our lives. But if you are a person of color and you are in a working class or poor community, you're looking at a high level of overpriced, non-affordable housing, which means you're immediately going to have a lot of density, right? Because people cannot afford to live in spacious digs. Furthermore, you have a whole history of housing segregation across class, which means that you're looking at consolidation and compounding. So the density and the lack of resources make social distancing almost impossible. That's one quick example. Then there's the long-term history of things like food deserts and the lack of pandemic supplies. There are many neighborhoods that don't have big box stores anywhere nearby, and there's very little transportation to them. So they are in tiny mom and pops that may or may not be able to stay open to provide the level of supplies that they might need. Drive up testing. This, seems obvious, but only if you have a structural racism framework in your mind. If you're trying to test people for contracting COVID-19 in poor communities, especially redlined and discriminated against communities, a drive-up testing site doesn't seem very bright. People cannot afford cars, particularly in big cities. You're looking at a long history of racial discrimination based on lending for automobiles, higher insurance rates. And so you have the whole communities with very few people who own cars. I'll give you one more example if there's time. Imagine the education impact. You young students who are now in distance learning, we know that communities of color, especially Black and brown communities, are on the short end of a profound digital divide. On what circumstances can that this pandemic exacerbate an already existing educational gap, lack of resources for poor schools that don't have a high tax property tax base, and now they have to learn from home in a house that is overcrowded with more people with limited digital access and already economically limited educational facilities. So that's the kind of connection we want to start to make when we're thinking about why COVID-19 is going to very likely impact poor people of color much more so than any other group.
Final thought, Tricia, that you would like our listeners to think about.
I think, what I would really love people to consider is to hold two things in their mind simultaneously. One is that we are all in this together, right? I don't want us to come away from a structural racism analysis and feel like this is a claim to say that some people are so much worse off that they're the only ones who are suffering. We are all in this together. But at the same time, in the other hand, I want your listeners to hold on to the reality that we're not in this together in the same way. And that the more we take that seriously, the more we will spend our energy fixing what we have broken in the past rather than aiming to restore society back to where it was. So I think that is really, a helpful way to think both about what connects us, what unites us, and what kinds of things really separate us in the long run. And we can fix that if we put our energy to that end.
And it is so vitally important. Tricia Rose, thank you for being with us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tricia Rose is the professor at Brown University, the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. She is currently working on a project that illuminates the way that structural racism works.